The call came in the middle of a meeting. A breathless, panicked voice cutting through the silence of his New York penthouse office. "Mr. Morgan, you need to come now. She's tying her up. The van is waiting." Charles Morgan had built an empire on reading danger. He knew the scent of betrayal, the weight of a threat. But this voice, Gabriella's voice, his maid's voice, carried something that made his pulse spike. Raw terror. He was in his car in 30 seconds flat. Los Angeles traffic had never felt slower. Every red light was an eternity. Every lane change was too slow. When he finally pulled through the gates of his Beverly Hills mansion, something was off. No guards at the entrance. No music drifting from the windows. Just an eerie, suffocating silence, broken only by the distant sound of sobbing. His daughter's sobbing. Charles moved through the foyer, his footsteps echoing on marble floors. Gabriella appeared in the doorway ahead, clutching her phone, eyes wide with horror, unable to form words. She pointed down the hall, her hand trembling violently. And then he saw it. He stopped dead. His wife, elegant and composed in her red dress, the woman he'd trusted with his home, his life, his daughter, was crouched over Joanna, thick rope in her hands. His 10-year-old daughter was on her knees, wrists being bound, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Daddy, please." Charles had orchestrated hits. He'd survived ambushes. He'd stared down federal prosecutors without blinking. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the sight of his wife, the woman who slept beside him every night, physically restraining his child for a kidnapping plot. In that frozen moment, he understood. The enemy he'd been guarding against in boardrooms and back alleys had been living under his roof all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Stay with me until the end, because what Charles does next will expose a betrayal that cuts deeper than any bullet. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Charles's hand was still on the doorknob when Gabriella's scream tore through the mansion. Not a call for help, a primal sound of desperation that echoed off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. She stumbled toward him from the living room entrance, her maid's uniform askew, phone clutched in white-knuckled fingers, her face streaked with tears. She tried to speak, but only managed broken fragments. "Sir, I tried. I called you." She wouldn't. "The van, it's outside. I couldn't stop her." Charles moved past her, his body operating on pure instinct now. Every second counted. He could hear it clearly now, Joanna's voice, high and terrified, begging through sobs. "Please, please stop. Daddy's coming. He'll be here. Please." The living room doors were wide open. And there, in the center of their pristine white marble floor, beneath the Italian chandelier he'd imported for their wedding reception, was a scene ripped straight from his nightmares. His wife knelt over their daughter like a predator over prey. The red dress, the one he'd bought her last month, now seemed to pulse with violence. Her perfectly manicured hands worked the rope with practiced efficiency, wrapping it around Joanna's small wrists, pulling it tight. Too tight. Joanna was on her knees, her blue dress torn at the shoulder, her hair disheveled and stuck to her tear-soaked face. She wasn't fighting anymore. She'd gone limp, sobbing so hard her whole body shook, her voice reduced to desperate whimpers. "Daddy, Daddy, help me." His wife's face was twisted with something Charles had never seen before. Not the loving smile she wore at dinner parties. Not the soft expression she used when she kissed him goodnight. This was rage. Pure, unfiltered fury. Her lips were pulled back, her eyes wild, her movements sharp and violent as she yanked the rope tighter. "Shut up," she hissed at Joanna. "Your father isn't going to save you this time. You're my ticket out, you spoiled little brat." Behind Charles, Gabriella was crying into her phone, her words tumbling out in Spanish, calling for help that wouldn't arrive in time. Charles felt something inside him break, then harden, then turn to ice. Let her go. His voice cut through the chaos like a blade. His wife's head snapped up at the sound of his voice, and for a split second, Charles saw everything. Every lie, every calculated smile, every moment of the past 2 years replayed in his mind like a film reel he'd been too blind to see clearly. He'd met her at a charity gala 18 months after Joanna's mother died. Charles had been drowning then, barely functioning, running his organization on autopilot while his daughter asked him every night when mommy was coming home. He'd stopped attending social events, stopped caring about anything beyond keeping his empire intact and his daughter breathing. But his associates had insisted. "You need to be seen, Charles. Weakness invites vultures." She'd been standing by the bar in a black gown that cost more than most people's cars. Stunning in that effortless way that came from good genes and better stylists. She'd approached him first, introduced herself with a smile that seemed to understand his pain without needing explanation. Victoria Castellano. Old money. European education. Impeccable pedigree. They'd talked for hours that night. She didn't ask about his business. She asked about Joanna. About his late wife. About grief and loneliness and the weight of single fatherhood. She'd seemed like a miracle, someone who understood the impossible balance between his two worlds. The courtship had been swift but felt natural. She'd met Joanna within weeks and had been perfect. Patient. Warm. She'd read bedtime stories and braided hair and slowly, painfully slowly, brought laughter back into their home. Charles had watched his daughter smile again and thought he'd found salvation. The wedding was small, elegant, everything Victoria wanted. She moved into the mansion like she'd always belonged there, rearranging furniture, updating security codes, asking innocent questions about his schedule. "What time do you leave for the office? When does your security detail change shifts? Which days are you usually home late?" Charles had answered everything. Why wouldn't he? She was his wife, his partner, the woman who held his daughter when nightmares struck at 3 in the morning. He'd given her complete access to his life, to his home, to his vulnerabilities. And she'd been mapping every single one, cataloging his weaknesses like intelligence operative preparing for extraction. Looking at her now, rope in hands, standing over his terrified daughter, Charles realized the truth with crystalline clarity. He'd invited a viper into his nest and called it love. Gabriella had seen it first. Of course she had. Staff always saw what employers missed, the small inconsistencies that didn't quite add up, the questions that lingered a beat too long. It started 3 months ago. Victoria asking Gabriella about Charles's patterns with an intensity that felt off. Does he always take calls in his study? Which mornings does he leave earliest? When does he usually check on Joanna at night? The questions came dressed in casual conversation, but Gabriella had worked for powerful men long enough to recognize reconnaissance when she heard it. Then there were the security gaps. Victoria would mention them at dinner, light observations that felt almost helpful. "I noticed the Westgate camera has a blind spot. The guards change shifts at 6, don't they? There's always a few minutes when no one's watching." Charles had thanked her, impressed by her attention to detail, never questioning why his wife was studying his fortress like a blueprint. Gabriella had kept her concerns quiet at first. She was staff. What did she know? But she'd started paying attention, watching Victoria when Victoria didn't know anyone was looking. The hushed phone calls in empty rooms. The way she'd dismiss Gabriella early on certain evenings. The tension that radiated off her whenever Charles changed his schedule unexpectedly. The breaking point came last Tuesday. Joanna had been looking for her favorite hair ribbon, the blue one her mother had given her years ago. She'd asked Gabriella to help search Victoria's room while Victoria was out shopping. They'd been looking through drawers when Joanna pulled out a phone. Not Victoria's iPhone with its designer case. A cheap burner, the kind drug dealers used on street corners. Joanna had turned it on before Gabriella could stop her. The screen lit up with messages that made Gabriella's blood run cold. Pickup window confirmed Thursday, 2 p.m. Target will be alone with housekeeper. Van staged at service entrance. Buyer ready, wire transfer on delivery. Gabriella had grabbed the phone, taken photos with her own, then put it back exactly where they'd found it. She'd sent Joanna to her room and spent the next hour deciding whether she was paranoid or whether Charles Morgan's wife was planning to sell his daughter to the highest bidder. When Victoria came home that afternoon and asked casually what time Charles would be leaving for his meeting Thursday, Gabriella knew with absolute certainty. She'd started watching the driveway, waiting for the white van. Victoria's hands froze on the rope. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Then she smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Charles had ever seen. Not because it was cruel, but because it was genuine. She was enjoying this. Charles. Her voice was silk over steel. Right on time. Gabriella's more reliable than I gave her credit for. She stood slowly, dragging Joanna up with her, one hand fisted in the child's hair, the other gripping the rope that bound her wrists. Joanna cried out, stumbling, trying to find her footing. Charles took one step forward. Victoria yanked Joanna backwards, positioning the girl's small body directly in front of her own. A human shield. His daughter's terrified eyes met his over Victoria's perfectly manicured hand. That's close enough. Victoria's tone shifted, all pretense of affection evaporating like morning fog. This was business now. Cold. Calculated. Here's how this works. You're going to wire $50 million to an account I'll provide. Then you're going to walk back to your car, drive away, and forget you have a daughter for exactly 6 hours. Charles's jaw tightened. You won't make it out of this city. Oh, I think I will. Victoria pulled Joanna tighter, making the girl whimper. There's a van waiting at your service entrance. Driver's been paid. Route's been planned. By the time your people figure out what happened, Joanna and I will be on a private plane to a country that doesn't have extradition treaties with the United States. This was never about me. Charles's voice was deadly quiet, the tone he used right before someone disappeared permanently. Victoria laughed, sharp and bitter. God, you're slow. Of course it wasn't about you. The Boston Syndicate sends their regards, by the way. Seems they've been trying to find leverage against the great Charles Morgan for years. Turns out all they needed was someone willing to play the long game. She tilted her head, studying him like a specimen. You made it so easy. The grieving widower. The devoted father. All I had to do was smile and pretend to care about your damaged little girl. Joanna sobbed harder, her small body shaking. Charles felt his control fracturing. But control was what had kept him alive for 20 years in a business where most men didn't see 30. He forced his voice to remain calm. What's the account number? Victoria's composure cracked, and suddenly words poured out like poison from an infected wound. You want to know the worst part? I almost felt sorry for you. The mighty Charles Morgan, so desperate for someone to fill the hole his dead wife left that he didn't see what was right in front of him. She jerked Joanna closer, ignoring the girl's whimper. Do you have any idea what it's like? Playing house with a man who treats you like a decorative object? You never loved me, Charles. You loved the idea of me. The perfect wife to complete your perfect image. Someone to stand beside you at galas and smile for the cameras and raise your daughter so you didn't have to feel guilty about being an absent father. Charles's hands clenched at his sides. Behind him, he could hear Gabriella's ragged breathing, her whispered prayers in Spanish. I gave you 2 years of my life, Victoria continued, her voice rising. 2 years of pretending to care about bedtime stories and school projects and your boring business dinners. 2 years of being invisible unless you needed me to play my role. Her eyes flashed with genuine rage now, the mask completely gone. You have everything, Charles. Wealth. Power. Respect. You take what you want and destroy anyone who gets in your way. So don't you dare look at me like I'm the monster here. You're using a child, Charles said, each word dropping like a stone into still water. I'm using the only leverage that matters to you. Victoria yanked on the rope, making Joanna cry out. This is your fault. If you'd seen me as a person instead of a replacement, if you'd actually loved me instead of just needing me, maybe I wouldn't have had to find my own way out. But you didn't. So here we are. Your daughter's my insurance policy, and you're going to pay for your inability to see what was right in front of you. Joanna's voice broke through the tirade, small and broken. Daddy, I'm scared. If you believe that no child should ever be used as a tool for greed and manipulation, hit subscribe right now. Only those who side with the worst kind of villain won't. Charles locked eyes with Victoria, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every dark thing he'd ever done. Account number. Now. Victoria's lips curved into a triumphant smile as she rattled off a string of numbers. Charles pulled out his phone, moving with deliberate slowness, watching her eyes follow every motion. She thought she'd won. She thought he was broken, desperate, willing to trade everything for his daughter's safety. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Charles typed slowly, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then he stopped, set the phone down on the marble side table, and smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile that made federal prosecutors wake up sweating. The smile that preceded bodies washing up in the harbor. You made one critical mistake, Victoria. Her eyes narrowed. Don't play games. Transfer the money or I hurt her. You assumed, Charles continued, his voice conversational now, almost pleasant, that because I loved my daughter, I was vulnerable. Weak. That grief had made me sloppy. He took one measured step forward. But men in my position don't survive by being careless. We survive by preparing for every contingency. Even the ones we pray never happen. Victoria's grip on Joanna tightened. What are you talking about? Joanna's bedroom doorknob. Charles watched recognition flicker across his wife's face. The brass one with the rose engraving. Her mother picked it out before she died. Sentimental value. He paused, letting it sink in. Also contains a pressure sensor. The moment someone tries to remove Joanna from her room against her will, it triggers a silent alarm. Victoria's face went pale. Not to the police, Charles continued. I don't trust police. It goes directly to my personal security team. Ex-military. Ex-intelligence. Very loyal. Very well paid. He glanced at his watch. They lock down every exit within 90 seconds. The house becomes a cage. Your van. He shook his head. Blocked in by 2 armored SUVs approximately 4 minutes ago. Behind him, Gabriella had stopped crying. She was staring at Charles with something between horror and awe. The gates are sealed, Charles said softly. The cameras are recording everything. And my men are positioned at every possible escape route. He took another step forward. Victoria stumbled backward, dragging Joanna with her. You're not leaving this house, Victoria. The only question now is whether you let my daughter go before things get considerably worse for you. Victoria's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Charles could see the exact moment panic overtook calculation, when the careful operative dissolved into something feral and desperate. You're bluffing. But her voice shook. She knew he wasn't. Test me. Charles's tone was ice. Please. That's when Victoria snapped. Her hand shot out and grabbed the bronze sculpture from the side table, an abstract piece that weighed at least 5 pounds. Sharp edges. Heavy base. In half a second, she had it pressed against Joanna's temple. I will bash her skull in right here, right now, if you don't. Charles moved. 20 years in organized crime had taught him one essential truth: hesitation gets you killed. While Victoria was still forming her threat, still calculating her next move, Charles had already closed the distance between them. His hand caught her wrist mid-swing, twisting with practiced brutality. The sculpture clattered to the marble floor. Victoria screamed, trying to maintain her grip on Joanna, but Charles had spent decades learning how to hurt people efficiently. He struck her forearm with his other hand, a precise blow that targeted the nerve cluster. Her fingers spasmed open. Joanna stumbled forward, still bound, sobbing. Gabriella rushed in and pulled the girl away, shielding her with her own body. Victoria wasn't done. She came at Charles with nails extended, going for his eyes with a fury born of pure survival instinct. She was faster than he'd expected, more trained than she'd let on. Her knee came up toward his groin. He blocked it, barely, and her elbow caught him in the ribs hard enough to crack something. They crashed into the side table. Glass shattered. Victoria grabbed a shard and slashed at his face. Charles jerked back, felt it graze his cheek, hot blood trailing down his jaw. She was screaming now, incoherent rage, everything about the sophisticated woman he'd married stripped away to reveal something savage underneath. Charles caught her wrist again as she lunged. This time he didn't hold back. He twisted hard, heard the distinct pop of a joint dislocating. Victoria shrieked. He used her momentum against her, sweeping her legs out from under her with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times in 100 different scenarios. She hit the marble floor with a sickening crack. The glass shard skittered away across the polished stone. She tried to rise, gasping, cradling her dislocated shoulder. Charles planted his foot on her chest, pinning her down with just enough pressure to keep her immobile. "Don't move." His voice was deadly quiet. Blood dripped from his cheek onto his shirt. "Give me one reason." "Just one." Victoria stared up at him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she looked genuinely afraid. The front doors burst open. Heavy footsteps thundered across marble. 4 men in tactical gear flooded into the living room, weapons drawn, moving with military precision. They swept the room in seconds, assessing the scene, Charles standing over Victoria's prone form, blood on his face, breathing hard. Gabriella clutching Joanna in the corner. The shattered glass. The discarded rope. "Secure her," Charles ordered, stepping back. 2 men moved immediately, hauling Victoria to her feet. She struggled weakly, her dislocated shoulder making her movements awkward and pained. They zip-tied her hands behind her back without ceremony. Charles turned away from her, walked across the room to where Gabriella held his daughter. Joanna's face was streaked with tears, her wrists raw and red from the rope. She was shaking so violently that Gabriella could barely hold her. When she saw her father approaching, something broke open inside her. "Daddy!" Charles dropped to his knees, gathering her into his arms. His hands shook as he worked the knots in the rope, his usually steady fingers fumbling with the coarse fibers. "I've got you, baby. I've got you. You're safe now." The rope fell away and Joanna threw her arms around his neck, sobbing into his shoulder with the kind of desperate relief that only a terrified child can express. "She said you weren't coming," Joanna choked out between sobs. "She said you didn't care. She said I was just." She lied. Charles held her tighter, one hand cradling the back of her head. "Everything she said was a lie. You hear me? Everything." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, using his thumbs to wipe away her tears. "I will always come for you. Always. Nothing in this world matters more to me than you." Joanna collapsed against him again, her small body racked with sobs. Charles looked up at Gabriella, who was crying silently, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Take her upstairs. Stay with her. Don't leave her alone for a second." Gabriella nodded, helping Joanna to her feet. The girl clung to her father for one more moment before letting Gabriella guide her toward the stairs. Charles watched until they disappeared from view, until he couldn't hear his daughters crying anymore. Then he stood, turned. The ice settled back over his features like a mask. Victoria was on her knees between the 2 guards, defiant even now. "You can't do this. I have rights. I'll call my lawyer." "You'll do nothing," Charles interrupted. His voice was quiet. "Final." He looked at his head of security, Marcus, a former Marine who'd been with him for 15 years. "She doesn't leave this property. No police. No lawyers. No phone calls." Marcus nodded once, understanding implicit in that single gesture. Comment, #Justice for Joanna, if you think Charles did the right thing to protect his family. Charles walked closer to Victoria, crouching down until they were eye level. "You wanted to know what kind of man I am? Now you'll find out." He stood, nodded to Marcus. "Make sure she understands the full extent of her mistake. Then handle it." "Yes, sir." Don't let evil schemes win. Like this video to support Charles and Joanna's recovery. Charles walked out of the room without looking back, leaving Victoria's protests echoing behind him. He had a daughter to comfort. Nothing else mattered. 3 weeks later, Charles sat in his home office watching Joanna through the window. She was in the garden with Gabriella, attempting to plant flowers in the beds her mother, her real mother, had designed years ago. Her movements were still tentative, cautious, but she was laughing. Actually laughing. It was the first time he'd heard that sound since the day Victoria's mask had shattered. The white van had been found abandoned 2 miles from the mansion, driver long gone. Charles's people had tracked him to a motel in Nevada within 48 hours. He'd talked. Eventually. Gave up names, accounts, the entire Boston syndicate operation. That information was now serving a very specific purpose in Charles's reorganization of the Eastern Territories. Victoria herself was gone. Permanently. Completely. The kind of gone where even asking questions was inadvisable. Charles felt no guilt about that. Some threats you eliminated. Some lessons you made sure were learned by everyone watching. The house had been swept 3 times. Every security system replaced. Every code changed. Every staff member vetted again with a kind of scrutiny usually reserved for enemy combatants. Only Gabriella had remained, elevated from maid to house manager and Joanna's personal guardian, with a salary that reflected both her loyalty and her bravery. Charles's business had undergone similar transformation. He'd restructured everything to allow remote management, delegating operations to trusted lieutenants who'd been hungry for more responsibility anyway. The penthouse office in New York sat empty now. The endless meetings, the late nights, the constant travel, all of it had been scaled back to the absolute minimum. Because he'd learned something in that living room, with his daughter bound and crying and a traitor wearing his wife's face. Power meant nothing if you weren't there to protect what mattered. Empires could be rebuilt. Territories could be won and lost. But Joanna? She was irreplaceable. And she needed her father present, not just powerful. He stood from his desk and walked to the window, pressing his palm against the glass. Joanna looked up as if sensing his presence and waved. A real wave. A genuine smile. Charles waved back, and for the first time in 3 weeks, felt something close to peace. If you hate manipulation, hit subscribe and never miss a story where the bad guys lose. The price of security, he'd learned, wasn't measured in guards or guns or surveillance systems. It was measured in presence. In showing up. In being there when it mattered most. Share this story to remind others that greed and betrayal always come with a price. And Charles Morgan would never make the mistake of forgetting that again.